Hi, everybody, and welcome. I hope everyone is staying well. I'm Anna Georgie, the Assistant Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. For those of you not familiar with the Aspen Institute, we are a global nonprofit that drives change through dialogue, leadership, and action. Within the Institute, the Energy and Environment Program has been gathering people to discuss energy and environmental challenges for more than 50 years, beginning at the same time and for the same reasons as the modern environmental movement and as Earth Day. Today, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, it's more important than ever to focus on solutions to our environmental crisis and their impact on people and health. That's why we're partnering today with Energy Futures Initiative to bring you this program focused on Earth Day 2020, climate action, and the climate and health nexus. For those of you interested in getting more involved in our program, please visit our website at aspeninstitute.org/EE or follow us on Twitter at AI Environment. I also encourage you to look for an invitation to our next digital program, which should be hitting your inbox soon. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Amy Harder. Amy is the author of a column on energy and climate at Axios called Harder Line. She previously worked for the Wall Street Journal as well as the National Journal and was the inaugural journalism fellow at the Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago. Amy will be starting out with a brief conversation with former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, followed by a panel with experts in the climate and health space. So with that, I'll turn this over to Amy now. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Anna, and for everyone around the country and maybe even the world that are tuning in right now. And I want to thank Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, who of course led the Energy Department under President Obama. I hope wherever you are that you are staying healthy and sane in what I have begun to call our grave new world. So Energy Secretary Moniz, it's really good to be chatting with you again today. I think his video will be turned on shortly. Oh, there he is. Hi, Secretary, good to see you again.
Hi. And I am staying healthy. I won't vouch for the sane part, but.
Well, I have a very important question, which is, when are you going to get your hair cut? Is it going to grow too long? Oh, you just did. So you can do that at home then.
Right.
Okay. Well, I wish I could do the same. But anyways, thank you again for being here. I want to encourage everybody who's tuning in on Zoom to also join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag climate and health. So Secretary Moniz, I was thinking about all the times where we've chatted. I think we had an interview in Las Vegas. We've had one in Morocco for the UN Climate Conference, and now here we are online. So that's a first. I have some questions for you about the bigger picture on the climate change debate, but then also some really tied to this pandemic that we're in today. So for my first question, how do you think this pandemic will affect the big picture on climate change and action for it, which had been growing before the virus had hit?
Well, I think there are clearly some very short-term effects that are massive. We can see that right now, given our mode of discussion here. And certainly for the energy sector, the enormous demand reduction, as you know, is roiling the energy industry. But I mean, frankly, I see no reason structurally why we're not going to return to a demand situation. We will need different kinds of jobs in the economy, and that's where I would make a primary link to your question. Namely, in my view, we're not going to simply replace all the workers we had in the same jobs. We're going to have to create new jobs. So a real question is, as we dig ourselves out of the economic hole, how should we use resources that create jobs, but also align with our future priorities? My argument is the clean energy transition is a primary opportunity to do that. Again, the data, and we have produced, along with the state energy offices, the data on energy jobs in the United States, and we see that energy jobs in the early stages of the transition have been growing at the order of twice the rate of the economy as a whole. So in other words, this is a great opportunity to get the new jobs and to really give a kickstart to going even faster on the energy transition.
How confident, though, are you that Washington, Congress, and the Trump administration, that they will include an explicit support for clean energy jobs and things like that? I mean, it seems like that's what you're saying is needed, but I'm not seeing a lot of action on that front.
Well, clearly these first pieces of the overall stimulus have had to address the very immediate problems of getting some, frankly, money in people's hands, preserving jobs for small business and the like. That's completely understandable. Getting the state and city budgets at least somewhat improved, clearly. But I believe that as we move forward, I believe there is going to be some additional major stimulus. I believe that there will be more of a turn towards this question about how do we get the economy back in the large sense. And again, that was my argument. I think the energy industry, it may not be unique, but it's very important. I might add that it's not only for the climate imperative, but in addition, back in the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security declared 16 critical infrastructure sectors, sectors that if they were significantly impacted would affect the whole country. By the way, and public health is one of those, but energy and communications were the two that were singled out as the enablers for the rest. So for lots of reasons, for the economy, for security, for our low carbon future, this would be really a prime opportunity, I think, for accomplishing multiple goals.
You talked about the demand. I'm guessing you're talking at least partly about oil demand. And this is obviously tangential to Earth Day, but very relevant given oil is one of the big reasons that the Earth's temperature is rising. So the coronavirus is putting oil prices and the oil and gas industry itself into a historic tailspin. The implications for the environment in the near term are pretty clear. We're having clearer skies around the world. But long term, it seems a little bit murkier. So Secretary, do you think that this moment signals the beginning of the end for the oil industry? Or do you think it's just a really bust of the boom and bust cycle of the oil industry?
Well, first of all, the air is going to get less murky in the future, not more murky, as we go to to the low carbon future, which will also have the corollary of eliminating or vastly decreasing at least other pollutants. And I might add that obviously no one likes this pandemic and the economic dislocation that is resulting in that cleaner air that you referred to. But I just would, in my optimistic view, say this is only a glimpse of the benefits we will eventually have with a robust economy and a very, very low emissions economy. So, a little bit of putting out there the goal. Now, in terms of the oil business, clearly that's a major area of demand destruction, down probably 35%. Although I do want to emphasize electricity is also down, approaching 10%, as our residential use goes up a little bit, but our commercial and industrial use goes down a lot. But on the oil sector, there are some things that are being done. I won't go into it in detail, but things like the Department of Energy is using a play in terms of using the petroleum reserve, extra space, if you like, to take some oil off the market right now, because the crash that you referred to is largely due to demand coupled with the exhaustion of storage space. But I think here we have a long-term secular change. It's clear. And in the long term, I would go back and connect this to the jobs issue again, because we can talk about the secular change in oil production and use over the next decades. And one might immediately say, well, there's an example of a major dislocation also of workers. Well, hopefully we can of course manage that. And in particular, one of the elements that I think is going to be very important in that low carbon future is building out a major carbon capture and sequestration business. That is going to draw upon the same kinds of skills that one has currently in the oil sector. So I think this is about managing this transition, going to low carbon, and seeing how the job structures in the country can draw upon the talents that we have. And when it can't, then we turn to people like our new partners, the AFL-CIO, with their tremendous apprenticeship programs, years of developing new skills in our workforce.
Right, and I want to ask about that in a moment, but just to finish up here on the oil front, I mean, do you think the oil industry is going to bounce back from this? Do you think it should bounce back? Or do you think all of these oil workers who are being laid off, should you just direct them to the carbon capture lane of jobs?
Well, look, I think, again, the transition is going to take longer than just bouncing back right now from this economic hole that we're in. I mean, look, I see no reason to doubt that we will see, the transportation sector rebound. Specifically, when we get out of our houses, we will start driving. We will increasingly be driving electric vehicles. But let's look at the numbers and just be honest about it. For example, we did a study about California's pathway to a 40% economy-wide reduction of emissions in 2030. The transportation sector in California is 40% of the emissions. So it's the long pole in the tent. When you look at California's aggressive goal to have 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, I think they can do it. But that does not change the fact that today there are 30 million light duty vehicles on the road in California. And in 2030, the projection is 35 million. So in other words, this transformation is going to take time. The EVs, for example, will certainly take off much more, even beyond 2030 and 2040, when, as you know, a number of countries are actually saying that we're only going to allow essentially zero carbon vehicles, zero emission vehicles after 2040. So it's going to take some time. There'll be a quick rebound as people get mobile again, but the secular change, I think, is occurring. I might add, electric vehicles certainly look to be the most promising right now for going to low carbon light duty vehicle emissions. But I wouldn't rule out that still, a breakthrough in advanced biofuels, other kinds of low carbon fuels, which can also be part of the mix.
But for me, it's hard for me to imagine people, many of whom are out of jobs and will be for, unfortunately, the foreseeable future. And with oil prices literally gone negative and gasoline prices cheaper than they've been in a decade or more, I don't see where, relatively speaking, more expensive electric vehicles will be the choice for many people. So I guess my question for you is that specific one, but also sort of bigger picture. I mean, the world is careening into a recession that some say could be worse than the Great Depression. So, typically we've seen in the past that when recessions hit, people's concern about the environment goes to the back burner. So why are you so optimistic that climate change action will remain moving as aggressively as it is, given the backdrop of our world today?
Well, first of all, I will be surprised if, when the data are processed a few months down the road, that we are not already in a significant recession. The question is, how long will that slope be to come out of that? Now, on the question of the EVs, I do think that, well, there are projections right now, particularly with, as you say, the extremely low oil and therefore gasoline prices, that the projections are for a slowdown in EV sales. But I personally think that it's going to be temporary. And the major point is that we are well on the road And I would certainly say between 5 and 10 years away from the cost of ownership of an electric vehicle auto and a combustion engine auto being the same. A little bit of a difference still maybe in capital cost versus operating cost, but cost of ownership, I think reaching parity in this decade for sure. And then when you add to that electric vehicles are really very fine performance cars, I think we're there to see a strong move in this direction.
Do you drive an electric car?
Not yet, but it will be my next one.
Well, some people say that the people will find private transportation, cars and such, to be more appealing than public transportation. Do you think that, after the pandemic, of course, do you think that the changes that are happening now, things like this, online events, and people's concern about being too close to people on the subway and things like that, I mean, do you think that could actually increase the demand for oil? Another example is plastic and its use in sending things through the mail. I got something today in the mail, and 3/4 of it was plastic packaging, which seemed incredibly wasteful. I mean, it seems like there could be a negative side to this even after we get out of the recession.
Well, look, again, there's going to be a complicated, very, very short-term dynamic here. I do not believe, and I don't underestimate that. And frankly, I think the views of this being kind of a V economic recovery are probably, it's going to be a kind of distorted V with one side going a lot longer out, I'm afraid. But long term here, I mean by 2030, I don't see any fundamental way that we are going to be deflected from going to this clean energy economy. For one thing, we are going to continue to see, unfortunately, an increase in natural events, hurricanes and fires and droughts and the like. I think the public is understanding much more than was the case certainly 10 years ago. This linkage to warming, to emissions, to the need to address this, and also the cost reductions. After all, look, in the United States, we have made significant carbon reductions without real national policy, and with roughly half of our states having things like renewable portfolio standards and the like. But the reality is we've done quite a bit just in the evolution of the energy system. Now this is going to continue now, I think, with further cost reductions for low carbon technologies. I do think that there's one area which has not been mentioned that does concern me about getting back on the track. Well, we have to get back on the track and then get on a new track because we weren't on a good enough track in terms of low carbon. We have to pick up the pace. But one of the implications of today's situation that does concern me going for the next years is that obviously we will have built up so much public debt that, and certainly if interest rates go up on that debt, it may be very difficult to find the kind of funding that I think we still should be investing in accelerating the low carbon transition. So,
could that build the case for carbon tax in Washington?
Well, I think carbon pricing is one thing that we will get, and we do need.
When do you think we'll get that? Do you have a time frame?
I will not mention my colleague's name. He is fairly well known, but I will soon be owing him at the end of this year some fine wine because I bet too early on the carbon tax. But I still think it will come soon. And
what was that bet that you lost?
Well, I bet that there would be economy-wide climate policy legislation by the end of 2020. This was made many years ago, well, I'm not feeling bullish about the bet coming out. I'd love to see it happen, but we'll see. But the thing I'll say there, Amy, is another concern, that your implication that a carbon price might suddenly look more attractive as a way to work down the deficit is obviously understandable. For example, George Shultz, Jim Baker et al. Proposed starting with a $40 a ton tax, and that's north of $200 billion. So, you know, it's appreciable. My problem with that is that if that were the path followed, it would be completely socially regressive. And I believe that we need to find a way to use those funds primarily to make sure that it is a progressive outcome going forward.
We have a few more minutes left. I want you to just briefly describe this new partnership that you announced with the AFL-CIO around jobs. And is it correct to say that you've been working on this even before the pandemic? And you know, I've noticed some comments among some progressive lawmakers to be a little bit dismissive of jobs in the fossil fuel industry. For example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a congresswoman from New York, she tweeted but then deleted a comment that said she was happy that oil prices had gone negative. Can you talk about why this exists? And you know, my reference or inference from it is that perhaps you're trying to respond to some of the dismissive nature that there has been of some jobs in these sectors.
Well, look, first of all, it's about looking at the jobs overall, okay? But what I would say is issues like stranded workers, stranded communities is really important. It's important for making progress on climate, because, you know, my favorite word, and it's in our Green Real Deal, if you want to go to our EFI website, my favorite word in the end is coalitions. We do not accomplish large systemic change very easily without building broad coalitions. And so the labor is one example of an important constituency. With any of those constituencies, if we don't bring them along in a coalition, and labor, by the way, 3 years ago, signed, the AFL-CIO signed its commitment to addressing climate change. So, I mean, we are together on that, and we're together on the jobs, because my point was, if we don't have coalitions coming together and pulling together, it always results in political headwinds to the direction we want to go in. If we can pull together labor and business and environmental groups and religious leaders, we could go on, pulling them all together is the way that we can get some tailwinds, because we need them. We are not on a pace that is getting us anywhere near where we have to be in terms of climate. And where we have to be, certainly our commitment, and my colleagues at EFI, we're very clear. It is a net zero economy by mid-century. We desperately need that. We're not on a pace. Again, to get on that pace, we need everybody pulling together.
Well, we just have just 2 or 3 more minutes, and with this time that we have, I want to do what I call a lightning round. So I'm going to say a phrase, and you say only one word that pops into the first word that pops into your mind.
Amy, many committee chairs in Congress have tried that, and it's never worked.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, and I expect you to listen a little bit more than people in Congress. So share the first word that pops into your mind when I say 100% renewable energy.
No.
No, that's your word? Okay.
Renewables will be extremely important, but I just don't see the entire system, and I don't mean electricity, I mean the whole system, industry, transportation, agriculture, coming together. Frankly, we've answered that question with a big study. Another one.
A lot more than one word.
I will refer you to. Well, I gave it one word, and now I'm explaining it. We published a paper on carbon dioxide removal. In other words, I certainly believe that we will achieve net zero, meaning we will have to have developed the technologies for significant negative carbon approaches. We're going to need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. If we do that, if we have some in the electricity sector, a significant component of base load, for example, you start putting together a system. Hydrogen, we are extremely bullish on as a complement cross-sectorally to manage all the different timescales you need with wind and solar, from very short to hours to days to frankly seasonal variations. So that's the way it comes together. We got to put everything in there. And by the way, that does also help with building a coalition.
2 more lightning round words for you to respond with one word, if possible. China.
It exists. That's 2 words.
And my last one is Joe Biden.
My friend.
Are you going to, or have you already endorsed him for president? Or is that
I'm not getting into politics here. I will just say that connecting Joe Biden with today's announcement with labor, I would say that when we were together in the Obama administration, labor was certainly a shared concern, a shared issue, and a shared commitment.
And in my final question, what is one hopeful thing that you can leave the nearly 400 people that are joining us today online? What is something hopeful that you can share with us? Anything?
Now I can give you a one-word answer. Innovation. We have tremendous capacity. We're doing it. And with the right incentives going forward, it's innovation will be our net zero 2050 solution.
Great. Well, Secretary, I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amy.
And I hope to see you again soon, whether online or in real life.
Okay, we'll do it.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye. And now we will transition to the panel discussion with 3 really great experts in this space on really the nexus of climate change and health. And we'll talk among the panelists for the next about 45 minutes. And then throughout this time, we'll be taking questions for the panel in the Q&A system here on Zoom. So please be, as I've noticed you already have been, asking questions, and then we'll compile those into a document that then I'll ask toward the end of this discussion. So I want to say thank you to our panelists for joining, and I'll just briefly introduce them. I'll remind you that their bios are in full on the website link for this event, so please be sure to reference those. First, we have Amy Luers. She's the Executive Director of Future Earth and the Director of the Center for Sustainability in the Digital Age, also affiliated with Future Earth. Then we have Jackie Patterson. She's Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Change Program and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP. And then finally, we have Michael Greenstone. He's Director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, where I had the pleasure of being the inaugural journalism fellow a couple of years ago. So it's great to see you all today. And I hope you're staying healthy and sane, just as importantly, in these weird times that we are living in. So I think given the coronavirus is really upending all of our lives, I think health and the health of our friends and family are on our minds more than ever. So, and of course, climate change is another kind of public health problem. And so I want to take this time to talk about the links that exist there and the experiences you guys have had in this area. So sort of an opening question. about the connections between this particular coronavirus and climate change. The experts that I've talked to say that no, climate change didn't cause this coronavirus, but that there are connections to be made. So Amy, if I could ask you to start, as you've been experiencing this pandemic, what comes to your mind in ways of how these two, climate change and pandemics, and in particular this coronavirus, are related?
Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the Aspen Institute and Energy's Futures Initiative for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Your question is an important one as well. The connections between climate and health and this COVID virus in particular is a complicated one. But I think the top line message that we all need to really remember is, simply put, a healthy planet is necessary for a healthy population, and a healthy planet is necessary for a thriving economy. And what a healthy planet means is a stable climate, healthy ecosystems, healthy oceans, healthy land systems. And so it's comprehensive. And I don't think you can think about climate without thinking about the whole planet. But let me unpack that a little bit more to get to some of the points you're addressing specifically around COVID, and make 3 points. One is that climate change is affecting our health today across the planet. And it's only going to get worse if we don't take immediate actions to tackle the climate crisis. And the second point is that climate and related environmental degradation, environmental change, is causing climate threats. It's causing new climate threats to populations around the world. And this includes the spread of infectious diseases and new threats related to increasing food insecurity, floods, droughts, extreme heats. And turning to COVID, for example, COVID is a zoonotic disease. That is a disease that jumps from animals to humans. And it turns out that 3 out of 4 of the new infectious diseases that the world experiences come from animals. They're zoonotic diseases. And the spread and the increasing spread of these is a direct result of our degradation of the land system. In the context of COVID, it was jumping from bats to humans, related to the degradation of bat habitat. And these types of increase of zoonotic diseases has been directly connected with things like deforestation. So the third point, though, I want to make is that climate and environmental degradation is not just influencing and driving, spurring new health threats. It's also making societies, populations across the world more vulnerable to existing threats and new threats. So let's go to COVID again. So in the COVID-19 example that we're experiencing today, recent research does show that populations that live in high air pollution areas are more vulnerable to the COVID-19 disease than those who live in healthier areas. And so in the context of climate, high polluting areas are driven by the carbon pollution, the burning of fossil fuels, and also the warming of the planet is making people more susceptible, their respiratory conditions more susceptible to diseases. So the response is that we can't ask questions and look for solutions in a linear way anymore. It's not a simple X causes Y. What we need to do is take a system approaches to these challenges and remember the top line message. A healthy planet is needed for a healthy population, and a healthy planet is needed for a healthy economy, thriving economy.
Jackie, I want to turn to you. In your role, I know you've been working, for so long on this nexus of how people of color are often disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And very much, unfortunately, we're seeing the same thing play out today with the coronavirus. So can you kind of take us into your world over the last few weeks to talk about what that's been like, both from a coronavirus perspective, just itself, because it's obviously a humongous focus of all of ours, but then also kind of connecting that to climate change and how you're sort of connecting them yourself in your head.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, on March 10th, I was on vacation, and as I was kind of starting to wrap my head around this whole coronavirus situation and start to see what was beginning to unfold. And I spent basically 24 hours writing this document called the 10 Equity Implications of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. Because as you say, coming from doing this work on environmental and climate justice, I saw the patterns, I was able to predict what's already come to pass in terms of the disproportionate impact on various populations. And it's based on having done this work on environmental and climate justice. Because as was stated before, the same underpinnings of the disproportionate impact of climate change are the same underpinning, the same systemic inequalities that cause the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. So whether it's racism and its impacts as it relates to the anti-Chinese sentiments that was happening, even the anti-LGBTQ and some of the fundamental religious communities, there was a blaming of LGBTQ populations for COVID-19, which was interesting. Found that whole body of media around that. And then, of course, the systemic racism that makes those facilities that are toxic being disproportionately located in communities of color then rendered our lungs more susceptible to COVID, which also attacked the lungs. And then issues around who's on the front lines of work, and then who gets protected on the front lines of work and who doesn't, was coming through as a pattern of inequity, as well as the historic redlining that meant that certain communities didn't have access to certain resources, whether it's food resources or otherwise, which then leads to some of the diets that exacerbates the very underlying conditions that make certain communities more susceptible. So just impact over impact and population over population, it's the same dynamics that we see that lead to climate vulnerability. So, and the solutions need to be not just kind of putting a Band-Aid, erecting a food bank today that's going to go away tomorrow, or whatever. It needs to be about actually putting in systemic changes. So we don't come to this juncture again and again and again, as we've done with the BP oil drilling disaster, Hurricane Katrina, the heat waves in Chicago, and now here with this. And we're going to continue to see these shocks in our society, especially as we're not making the commitments that we need to stave off the progression of climate change. So we need to have the systemic changes that are needed both to mitigate the impacts of climate change as well as to lessen the progression of climate change. Thank you.
Great points. I want to come back to some of what you just said in a few moments, but turning to you, Michael, I've already done some work with your team at the University of Chicago on some of the pollution data that you've tracked around the world. And I want to ask you in detail about that in a few minutes, but just kind of big picture, you've been working on the intersection of public health and climate change for quite some time. And so it seems like coronavirus is sort of the asteroid that's driving into both of those right now. Can you talk to us about what kind of connections you're making in your mind when it comes to the coronavirus and climate change and the intersection of public health?
Sure. Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be at this event hosted by Energy Futures and the Aspen Institute. So I guess first, let's just note it's Earth Day, and it's, I think, useful to go back in time to 50 years ago. And I like to think of version 1.0 of Earth Day being the last 50 years. And that 50 years was where environmental problems were pretty local in nature. And so the Cuyahoga River was on fire, and if people in Cleveland cleaned up the Cuyahoga River, that was going to suffice. They didn't have to worry about the people in Karachi or the people in Mumbai cleaning up their river. It wasn't going to affect them. I think we're now in a kind of a 2.0 world of Earth Day. And I'll make the connection to COVID-19 now. COVID-19 doesn't, it doesn't respect borders. It moves all over the place. And I think there's a really interesting parallel there with climate change. Emissions in Karachi, emissions in Paris, emissions in Warsaw have the same effect on Chicago as emissions that occurred in Chicago. And so just as there has to be global cooperation on addressing COVID-19, I think in this, what I like to think of as a 2.0 era of Earth Day, there's going to have to be global cooperation if we're going to be able to confront climate change, which I think is the existential environmental crisis of our time.
Embedded in a lot of what you guys have talked about is this idea of science and trust in science. And the coronavirus is really bringing up the good and the bad, and maybe even sometimes the ugly of trust in science and trust in experts. And this whole idea of trusting models and whether models show that they were overblown or that action worked. So I want to talk about this just for a few minutes. What kind of comparisons do you think or lessons learned could be made with the public debate happening about the science behind the coronavirus and the results of social distancing, for example, and how that could, what kind of lessons we could draw from that when it comes to climate change, which is of course a much longer term, far longer term problem than coronavirus. Amy, I know that you've gotten into a lot of this throughout your various roles. Can you talk about, like, are you hoping that this will increase the public's opinion of scientists and experts, and therefore could actually increase people's acceptance of the dire forecasts that scientists are making on climate change? Or do you think that's way too optimistic, and in fact, it'll just all be partisan, like it tends to be?
Well, if that was one of your rapid fire questions, my answer would be, and the question was, do I hope it will do this? It would be yes. But since it wasn't one of your rapid fire, I'll give you a little bit more of a nuanced answer. I mean, I think that, if you ask, do I hope? Of course, I hope that the role of science and subject matter experts and facts becomes more important. But I think that how I've been reflecting on it this more broadly is what are the things that as a society are kind of revealing to us through the COVID crisis that has an influence for how we think about tackling climate crisis. And I think one of these is certainly this, is that science, data, subject matter expertise matters. These crises, this sort of disease X has been predicted. In fact, I used to work at the Skoll Global Threats Fund, where Jeff Skoll brought together a group of experts and had us focus on what are those crises that could bring society to its knees in years, not decades. I oversaw the climate and water work, but we had a big pandemics team. They made a movie that actually, Contagion, that looks, paints this picture. So this is not a surprise really. But there are three other issues that I think are related to this and are wrapped up in this issue of science. I think that one has already been said, but I would put it slightly differently, and that is that, and this is also what science tells us, the biggest threats we face today are not deterred by national borders, but our governance structures are focused on managing, our global governance structures are focused on around a national border structure. And I think that needs to change. The other thing that I think we need to learn, and again, this is connected to science, is that early action is critical when we're talking about exponential curves. Exponential growth curves, climate scientists talk about this all the time. That's why we need to take early action now, because we're on an exponential curve. We're on a rapid curve growth. And if we don't stop now, the accumulation of that growth will increase. And that understanding and hearing that as a scientist, people talking about these issues in that way and seeing the connections are really powerful. And the other one is the sort of the concept, again, connected to science, is that international collaboration is critical, and we are as strong as the weakest link. And I think all of these are vividly true in this context, and they're all things that I hope we can learn as we transfer and think about addressing the climate crisis.
Great, thank you. Jackie, I want to go back to something that you said about systematic change and how that's needed, and kind of link that to this discussion that we're having on science. I mean, science and data in general, shows a pretty clear picture of what happens to certain communities, particularly communities of color. Are you confident that society, at least here in America, will learn a lesson in this experience and bring about systematic changes? Or are you worried that we're just going to go back to where we were in a couple of years' time?
Yeah, both. I would say that that there have been some interesting advancements that I've seen already. For example, colleague of mine was talking about the mutual aid that they're doing in their community, and the support that they're giving to the local food efforts there. And we talked about how do we and she talked about how they're planning on not just doing the local food in the moment, but actually starting a local food movement in their community that will be sustained long after this disaster. And those are the types of conversations that we need to be having. We're talking about energy. We know that a number of communities and individuals suffer from electricity shutoffs, and often these are the very same communities that are host to these coal-fired power plants or oil and gas facilities that are harming the health and well-being of the communities, but yet they're more likely to have the economic strife that results in shutoffs. And so actually talking about decentralizing energy so that people are actually owning their own energy, generating the energy from natural resources that are regenerative, and having building wealth and sustainability with that. And so these are the kind of messages and movements that are being reinforced by this really pointing out in such an acute way the failure of the existing system that's built on profits before people. And I would also just want to make a comment about the science piece in particular. One is that on a positive note, we are seeing so much more of science represented on the news. I'm watching CNN 24 hours a day, and we're seeing much more in the way of science that's happening, that's being discussed on a positive note. On a challenging note, in our communities, we have seen historically how there's been a conversation about conspiracy theories in African-American communities and otherwise relates to this. But unfortunately, in the past, these conspiracies haven't been theories. They've been actual. So whether it's the Tuskegee experiment or the use of the DNA of Henrietta Lacks, we've just seen time and time again where people who are supposed to be stewards have actually been intentionally deceiving our communities and using, and for the sake of science, so to speak, and using messaging that's actually in passing misinformation. So this is a challenge for our communities. And so for us, it points to the need for more in the way of our communities being the scientists, and in terms of getting more of our communities involved in STEM, and also more in the way of community-based participatory research, so that we are not just kind of relying on something to be told to us when there's been a mixed bag in terms of whether it's actually been factual or in our interest in any way. Thank you.
Great, Michael. I want to shift that science question to be a little bit slightly more political in nature to you, given you have spent time in Washington, so I figure it can't hurt to ask. Do you think that this will, there's been some lawmakers and others in the political sphere saying that because the curve has been flattened more quickly than some of the models had initially said, that's evidence that those models were wrong. And some people have gone a step further to make that connection to climate change. What's your response to those types of comments?
Yeah, I think those are probably pretty typical comments. I guess in the scientific world, we often have a peer review process, and anyone is welcome to say anything, but there has to be evidence behind it. And I think on cable TV shows and sometimes in political discourse, that same disciplining device does not exist. So I think the people who are saying things like that are probably people who were always going to say climate change wasn't true and are just trying to catch the latest train leaving the station. So I wouldn't put much stock in that.
So now I want to do one of my lightning round questions. So you just answer with a one-word answer. Do you think the coronavirus and the recession that we are probably already in, do you think it will ultimately help or hurt efforts to combat climate change? So your answer is either help or hurt. Anybody can go first.
Oh, I think it'll hurt.
Depends.
That's technically one word. Jackie?
Mixed.
You guys must be living in Washington because you know how to evade the question. Well, we got a straight answer from The Economist, which is
Both hands.
So let me ask you, now that we've mostly abided by that rule, why do you think it'll hurt?
Oh, I think climate change involves spending money today for benefits in the future. And I think the immediate needs are going to be very acute in many parts of the United States, but in many parts of the world as well. And that's going to make it harder to prioritize spending on or investments, think of them, that pay off in the future. Also, this isn't all COVID, but it seems like fossil fuel pricing has broken down, and we may be in a long period of, we thought we were in already low prices, and I think we might be in a very long period of low prices for fossil fuels. And in general, in economics, when the price goes down, people buy more of it. So,
Jackie, I want to turn to you and kind of continue on this idea that Michael brought up about dealing with things in a more eminent way and dealing with cost today. I had some recent interviews with a couple of civil rights activist leaders, Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, and then also Mark Morial of the National Urban League. And they expressed to me concern about shifting too quickly off of natural gas, given, they said, concerns of people of color about energy affordability and things like that. If you had any general comment on that, but also sort of to tie it to this topic, are you concerned that you're going to be dealing with sort of a triple whammy, the environmental impacts, the coronavirus impacts, and now, energy costs, which often disproportionately impacts people of color? I mean, so how are you thinking about that in terms of your workspace and of your community?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the reason that I said mixed was because, I mean, certainly the coronavirus is just bad all around, so there's no silver lining, but the impacts on organizing around climate are mixed in that, again, it is surfacing these deep systemic challenges that need to be dealt with in a systemic way. And the fact that more folks are realizing that, and that we are starting to see some conversation and some programming around how do we, around building systems and programming and so forth that address the short term, but then are sustained, and practices that are sustained in the long term, that are both climate resilient, climate mitigating, and addressing the COVID-19 challenge. So, and I gave a couple of examples of those already, but yes, there are the complexities around whether it's energy. And so for us, as I said before, what we're talking about energy sovereignty for the long term, and how can we actually build decentralized energy that's clean energy and more energy efficient, focus on energy efficiency, so that we don't trade harms. I mean, it's even just like this whole to open or not to open. It's to continue with that. Natural gas might be in the short term what someone would consider to be economically more viable, but it's harming our health and well-being of our communities disproportionately, as well as the planet and our general public health. So those aren't the kind of choices that we should have to make. We should really be focusing on how do we reduce the amount of energy we need to produce in the first place, and how do we make sure that we're producing energy in the cleanest way possible.
Amy, I know that you've done obviously your work focuses a lot on sustainability in this digital era that we're living in. And I think COVID is certainly accelerating that corner of our lives. I think for better or worse, I think mostly worse, things like this are now going to be online only. To what impact do you think these types of changes could ultimately save some carbon emissions? And if people adopt it enough on a mass scale, do you think it could actually make a difference? If none of us are driving or flying to these conferences and things like that, or is that really just sort of tinkering on the edges?
Well, there's no doubt that, there have been, billions of people who are shifting more of their personal and business life onto online. And I do believe that there will be long-term implications of this in the context of people really recognizing that people that have jobs that bring them all traveling around the world, that a lot more can happen online. And I think that that will actually have a long-term effect on the transportation industry. But and in some ways, you know, there's a real importance of this, you know, the role of the digital sector in terms of, you know, providing some sort of resilience to the parts of the economy. But of course, the big challenge, and I think this is really connected to sustainability issues more broadly, is that what this has also really, really highlighted is huge challenges that we have within the digital sector. In particular, the digital divide. You know, almost 50% of the world are not online. And a lot of them are in the developing world, but not all of them. There are 20 million people in the US that aren't online. So these inequities are becoming much more apparent. And it's not just if you're online, it's whether you can have a job that's that can function online. And these inequities are huge. And I want to pull out two different points that also relate to what you raised earlier that are really being highlighted in the context of thinking about the digital space. One is trust. So you brought this up earlier in the context of science, and the digital age, thinking about trust in a world that's not only sort of allows many voices to have equal airtime, but also in a world where increasingly we're looking to models for answers, and AI and digital technologies that are really powerful tools. But how do we make sense of trust and accountability, and who is defining the truth of the world today? I'm hoping that science continues to play an incredible role, and it will, but we have to rethink how these all fit together in this new world, which becomes more important every day. And the final issue is, how do we think about privacy? You know, there's issues with people coming into Zoom, but there's also issues in the context of the digital world with surveillance. And, you know, this is increasing in a new way under this guise of emergency. But how will that change, and how will people think about that change as we move forward and we try to build resilience to these broader issues, and we try to build collectivity? I think these are going to be really important issues, and they're really related to the rapidly changing digital sector in our society. And the one thing I really think about these days, and this makes it so clear, is that our interdependence is really connected through as a humanity, our dependence increasingly on not just the natural world, but also the digital world. And that has to be, I think, front and center as we address these issues.
Great, thanks, Michael. I want to go back to something I mentioned at the beginning, which is that you and your team have been working on getting pollution data from around the country and around the world. I included a quote from Michael in my column this week, where, and I'm stealing his thunder a little bit, about India and the experience there. So Michael, can I get you to talk about your reflections on the data that you found with particulate pollution dropping in India quite a lot when the lockdown happened there? And then also my second question to that is, what kind of impact, if any, have you found on pollution here in the United States?
Great, so thanks. So what Amy's referring to is we produced some data on what the lockdown has done with respect to particulate pollution in several parts of the world. In India, we found a very sharp reduction, maybe about 20% reduction in particulate matter pollution just in the first few weeks. In contrast, in the US, it was very hard. There's individual cities where you can see big reductions, but on average, it was hard to detect anything because the levels are so low relative to the rest of the world.
Because we already have really clean air, like the president says.
We have clean air. It doesn't mean that there aren't places that have elevated levels, but we definitely have clean air. But something that you and I talked about when you were doing some research for your column, I just want to raise it here. When I look back at the history of Earth Day, this statistic, I was just doing some reading about it, was really kind of amazing. 10% of the American public was in the streets on Earth Day in 1970, 50 years ago. So that was 20 million people, that'd be 30 million people today. What came out of that was a pretty single-minded focus on fixing local environments. And so that meant air pollution, and it meant the Cuyahoga River and water pollution. what I said to Amy is that I think China kind of had their Earth Day in about 2014 when they declared a war on pollution. And that led to a very single-minded focus there on reducing air pollution. And what I would say as we look forward, and I want to think of this as this next 50 years of Earth Day, is that if we want Earth Day to have the same meaning and resonance when people are talking about it in 25 years, we're going to have to decide if we want to have the same single-mindedness about it and what that single-mindedness would be about. And, you know, Jackie and Amy have brought up very important issues, central issues for American society and global society about the digital divide, privacy, energy sovereignty. And in my experience, when you try to accomplish many goals at once, there's a risk that not much progress is made on any of them. And so what I would pose is that for a successful Earth Day 2.0, I think we have to decide what we want to accomplish. And if we try to accomplish too many things, my concern is that we will not be very successful. And I would put out there, which is probably obvious, that I think the most important thing to focus on is CO2 emissions. That's really the existential threat in Chicago, where I am, in Seattle, where Amy is. I don't know where Amy and Jackie are, maybe Washington, I'm not sure. But also in Pakistan and India and Paris and around the world.
Great. Sort of a more eminent decision-making process that we are all closely watching, I'm guessing, is the state of things in Washington, D.C. So I have a question on that. Just a quick housekeeping reminder question, comment. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to throw it out to you in the virtual audience. And I'm seeing lots of questions populate the system. So please chime in there, and our colleagues at the Aspen Institute will put those together. So then I can ask those questions on your behalf. And I'll also include your name and possibly where you're coming from, just so we can kind of see the global reach of this event. But going back to Washington, so we've seen a couple of big pieces of legislation come out supporting, you know, just average Americans, and then also some targeted industries. What are each of you looking for to be included in these packages that are being discussed? Maybe Amy, I'll start with you.
I just can't let the last comment go, though, that Michael did. So I'm just gonna make one moment, because I appreciate your point of, you know, everything's connected. How can we actually tackle the systems-based approach? But to see the climate challenge and to see our sustainability challenge as CO2, I think is a really, really big mistake. First of all, climate is a critical part of climate, is building climate resilience. And if we don't tackle climate resilience, essentially, as far as I'm concerned, the CO2 issue is become sort of irrelevant, because we really have to deal with these together. And in that context, I actually think that this issue of even thinking about this, you know, is in terms of thinking about COVID as, does it create an opportunity to address climate? And are these conflicting issues of whether we deal with COVID and climate? I just think the whole messaging around this is something that we really have to address, because I really think the messaging around it is not, does it create an opening to address climate or environmental issues? It's really that we cannot, if we want to, we can tackle this crisis, and we have to tackle this crisis in a crisis response, and, you know, get down the curve today, save people's lives. That's the urgent need. But in the long run, what we need to do, and I don't mean long run, I mean the medium run, when we're starting to build back or bounce forward, if we really want to bounce forward, we need to think about this crisis as one manifestation of a global systemic crisis, which is at the undermining, cross-cutting about the degrading of our environment. And if we don't approach it that way, then we're just going to see one COVID crisis after another. So quickly, in that context, if I think about building back and where the investments and pieces are, if you think about that in a holistic way, I think that there are three, you know, there are a number of different sectors, but 4 sectors that really come to mind in terms of thinking about this as, if we want to avoid the next, we have to rethink these sectors. One, of course, is energy, and that is true because of the cost, the negative costs these days of it's going to, I don't know where that's going to play out. I'm sure Michael and others on the phone, on the call know more than I, but rethinking that piece in this space is obviously very important. And the other three, I would say, that we really need to think about. One is agriculture and our food system, in a way that it's not just about CO2, but really focuses on saying, how do we develop, how do we, learn from this and reinvest in developing a more sustainable agricultural system. And there's a lot of research been done in directions of that. The other one, of course, is mobility, the airplane industry. How are we going to restructure that, but other mobility as well. And then the last one, and it's not a comprehensive list, but the kind of top of mind when I think about it, is the digital sector. As I said, this is a huge issue that's going to have ramifications in the context of how we govern, how we trust each other, and that could undermine all efforts or could empower us to do things in a different way that could really have a transformative effect.
Great,
if I could just jump in for 1 second, Amy,
rebuttal, yes.
Yeah, not even a rebuttal.
I want to get Jacqueline on that too.
No, she's Amy's exactly right. I said CO2, I really mean climate change. And of course, climate resilience has to be part of that. We have to reduce emissions and protect ourselves. There's no doubt.
Okay.
Jackie, if you wanted to chime in on that question as well, and then turning to the one in Washington, what kind of things are you hoping and perhaps even working toward to be included in any sort of longer term stimulus packages?
Yeah, so yes. So for one thing, I would say that as we think about, even if we agreed, for example, that climate change as a whole is what we need to address, I think that as a focus, I think even when we talk about resiliency, there's so much embedded in resiliency. So because we have to mitigate the progression of climate change, but we also have to adapt to the fact that climate change is already here and already hurting communities and people. And so that pretty much by definition means that it has to be a multi-solving model, just kind of practically in terms of alleviating the impacts on folks. But then also, even from a political standpoint, if we want to get political investment, the policies that have been the most successful around emissions reduction and so forth have been ones that have been multi-solving models. So whether it's the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which included workers' rights, which included job creation, which included all of these components that are critical in order to have health and well-being for communities. And so when we talk about the Illinois Clean Jobs Act, the Maryland Clean Jobs Act, each of these are multi-solving models that are focusing on public health, focusing on economic well-being, focusing on transit equity, and focusing on water security and food security and so forth. So I do think we need to be thinking in terms of intersectionality in order just for the well-being of people and in order to get the type of political buy-in and political will from the masses.
When it comes to the stimulus package, are you working specifically on this issue right now of trying to get certain provisions in, and what are those?
Yeah, so just even the very things that I named are the types of things that we're trying to get into the stimulus package, making sure that it does include all of those and more, including multiple social service pieces that are being neglected.
Have you had any success so far in the measures that have passed?
We've definitely seen some integration, but we would love to see more. We continue to kind of keep going back and saying we need to be considering everything from incarcerated persons to utility shutoffs to student loan cancellation and so forth. So we continue to push for inclusion.
Great, Michael. I'll go to you before I go to audience questions. What do you think Congress should do in the broader stimulus packages in order to make it a greener recovery? Or do you sort of reject that that's how the process should go?
Well, I think the first thing is to deal with the crisis at hand. And Congress has been surprisingly successful at that so far. It's not that there will probably need to be more packages. I think particularly state and local governments are seeing their revenues dry up and their expenses go up, and they can't borrow because of these balanced budget requirements. So I think there's going to be a need to help state and local governments more. And I think we have to continue to devote tons and tons of resources to understanding the disease, testing for the disease. And I think that's really got to be job one. Now, once that is satisfied or reaches some satisfactory level, are there opportunities to make investments that would better prepare us for climate change? That's absolutely the case. Certainly true before COVID. And in that spirit, I think there's lots of room for investment in energy R&D. There's probably some room for investing in other areas where there's market failures, like setting up the infrastructure that might allow EVs to compete a little bit more successfully. Of course, I think the ultimate policy option with respect to climate change is that when you emit CO2 in the atmosphere, you're dumping damage around the planet, and everyone knows the perfect answer to that is a carbon tax. I'm not holding my breath that that's going to appear in a stimulus bill, but if you wanted to design the most effective stimulus bill around carbon, that's what you would include that.
Were you involved in that bet that the secretary apparently lost?
I was not. I would have taken the other side. So I would have been receiving the bottle of wine.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to follow up with the secretary about that. Quick question on the stimulus packages. Do you think the oil industry should be bailed out in some way?
I don't get that argument. I think there might be an argument for helping some of the workers, but when prices go up, I don't think there was a mechanism for them to share the bounty with the rest of us. And there's this strange dynamic that has developed here, which is we seem to forget that we're consumers of oil, and low prices are, aside from the climate component, good for American people. And so I don't really think we should be in the business of supporting the OPEC cartel.
Great. I want to go to the audience questions. I'll start with a question from Joe Aggio from Nairobi, Kenya. Given the ultra-nationalism and inward-looking national policies that could follow the pandemic, what does the post-COVID-19 dispension portend for climate governance at the global level? Anybody want to jump in there?
I think that is a terrific question. This is the connection I was trying to make at the beginning between COVID-19 and climate change. It reveals both of those are real threats to our well-being, and that you can't solve them by yourself. And there's just such a tension when we're in a period of nationalism that's being exacerbated by COVID-19, how we're going to get back to solving problems where a ton of emissions in Karachi does the same damage in Chicago, where I live, as a ton of emissions that was done in Chicago. And we can't solve it unless nations are working together, and that is just not in the air right now.
Yeah, I guess I would sort of, highlight that too. And I mentioned, the criticality of both of these and this is such a visceral recognition that what someone else does matters to what happens to me. And it's, I think, more personal than we probably ever will get with climate. But I think the question I have is what will be that transition of sort of the next phase of global governance? Will there be a greater engagement of subnational in cross-country engagement? That's already happening in the climate world. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for her discussion of polycentric governance, a much more matrix governance systems of global issues, of these pieces where one person is affected by by the effects of others. And my hope is that the combination of, if we can actually manage the digital sector in a more effective way, if we can govern that in a way that could empower, if we could have an open data, transparent world, which is ethical and equitable and governs. There are a lot of ifs there, I realize it, but it could be such a powerful piece that I think diving into that and then govern and then sort of helping that contribute to the development of a new types of governance of these sort of big threats that go across borders and aren't really defined by the national bodies anyway. And how can that complement the existing structures? I think that this could push us to think about those things in a different way, but boy, we have some tough questions ahead.
Great. Another question from some anonymous person. Many states are establishing green banks to focus on helping lower income citizens access solar and energy efficiency by leveraging public and private investments. Do you think that a national green bank could help drive energy poverty relief across the country? Maybe Jackie or Michael, do you want to chime in on that one?
Michael, did you have a?
Oh, I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. I have something I might add, but I feel like this might be, you're more of an expert.
Okay. Yeah, I do think, I mean, so it's interesting in terms of a national green bank, but certainly I'm a part of a group called the People's Solar Energy Fund, which is doing just this very same thing, leveraging public and private investments in order to help local communities to finance solar. Not as much energy efficiency, but definitely solar. And I've seen the green bank model really working very well in Connecticut. I know there's a great green bank model going there. So I'm a strong supporter of the green bank model as someone who's implementing and observing. But the National Green Bank, I'm not as clear of what the mechanism would be in terms of that, but any way that we could scale up the green bank model, I think is something that should be under consideration for sure. So what's that say?
You know, I would just add to that. I think in a lot of these policies, and again, like Jackie, I don't quite know all the details of what the questioner has in mind about the National Green Bank, but it's very important to ask, what problem are we trying to solve? And in some instances, there's multidimensional problems. I think often it would be more constructive if we focus in a lot of these initiatives on what's the cheapest way to get CO2 reductions. And so I would just, add that I think it would be terrific if these kinds of green banks were able to calculate what's the cost per ton of CO2 abated. Now, there might be other goals to go along with that, and that's terrific, but I think transparency in what the goal is and what the outcome is really critical as we move to a period where reducing carbon emissions becomes more and more urgent.
I have a question from Steve in Colorado. Knowing the science and communicating it isn't the main challenge. We have understood the rational causes effects of climate change well for a while, but how do we persuade people psychologically and emotionally? And how does the appeal to the skeptical need to fundamentally change?
Well, that is a terrific question. I would love for my panelists the co-panelists to answer that.
Amy, it looked like you were about to.
Well, I guess one, I'm not sure we're going to convince the most skeptical. I think the people who are the most skeptical, I think that there's even science to show that a lot of it, especially in the US, those are connected to deeper beliefs that really aren't about the facts. So it seems to me that the response that I would have to that is that we need to look for those system changes that that can drive, make those decisions commonplace, and that is about restructuring the energy system. Yes, there is a rise, the cost of renewables is going down. The transition has to happen faster, and there are political barriers for that for sure, which requires votes. I understand that. But I think that we're going to have to make structural changes where we can overcome some of those political barriers that aren't going to be relying on convincing someone who is a real denier. I don't think that's a winning argument, a winning pathway. And given that we have limited resources, it seems like there are other big challenges that you might have to face to break down the structure in terms of governance and decision making. But I think if you choose your battles, trying to spend a lot of time convincing those who are going to be not convinced is probably not worth the investment. That doesn't mean I don't think community engagement is critical. I just wouldn't focus it on them.
Yeah, and I would say that this is why I'm such a proponent of the multi-solving model, so that we're meeting people where they are, and we don't, and so as long as someone can see some benefit that they would get out of what's being proposed, then in some cases where, especially with the folks who are kind of stalwart, not believing or whatever, they would be able to be invested in whatever is being proposed based on some other aspect of what's being proposed that would benefit them directly. So go on.
Here's a question that's a good follow from.
Oh, can I just jump in on that one? Sorry, Amy. You know, I think there's a temptation to dismiss people who fight against the climate science as being irrational, and maybe defined in a particular way, that's right. But I think a lot of it is actually people's sense that it's just too costly relative to what they, where they are. So my response would be that the right policy response to that is we need to invest more in bringing down the cost of low carbon energy and climate solutions. And I think prices and making it seem like a better deal can often help people change their mind. So maybe that's a typical thing for an economist, but that would be my reply.
But I just iterate that that's sort of what I was sort of saying too. In other words, rather than trying to convince them that it is worthwhile, you just got to set something up so it just is something that they do, and whether they believe it or not becomes irrelevant, kind of,
So
you know?
Yeah, this next question kind of is getting a little bit of what you guys are talking about, and it comes from Tisha Schuler. She asks, instead of doubling down on an approach to climate and health that historically divides us, how can we use the disruption and urgency of COVID to build a new shared paradigm around recovery and rebuilding? Jackie, I see you nodding your head. So like that idea?
Yeah, just because I think that COVID-19 is raising the questions about the commons. You know, what are all the things that we need to be able to survive and thrive to some extent, and making sure that we all have access to those things. So I think being able to have that conversation around kind of standards, human rights standards, and making sure that there's a shared belief of what those standards are, and a shared understanding of how we protect those standards, I think is an important conversation that's being raised in the context of COVID-19. So I know we don't have that much time, but that would be my initial response. Thanks.
Great. I have one more question from the audience, from Mark White. He asks, Mr. Greenstone stated that our biggest concern focus should be CO2 emissions / climate change, as you later explained. The former energy secretary noted that net zero carbon can't be done with renewables alone. What do the panelists suggest for solutions to reduce carbon emissions? So some technologies, I think, is perhaps what he's going for.
Yeah, I don't want to pick the technologies. I want markets to sort it out. I think.
Or policy. I mean, and we know you love a carbon tax, so I guess.
Yeah. So like, but look, it's like easy to mock the economists in favor of a carbon tax, but if we're serious about it, we have to let entrepreneurs and innovators who have really good ideas and have no market for their product, we have to let them work. And there's nothing that would liberate their ideas more than providing a market for them. And I think until we do, it's going to be hard to think that, it's going to be hard to know what's going to solve the problem. It's going to be hard to think we're being very serious about it.
So I'll add that. I mean, I think that prices, of course, matter. I'm not an economist, but I'm not. I definitely see the importance of that. But I guess I would also throw in there an item that isn't talked about as much. And I do think that focusing on the transformative changes that the digital transformations have had on society is something that's really important to recognize, right? So the IPCC's special report, 1.5 degree report, said if we're going to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees rise, we need to have cross-cutting systems changes across all systems, sectors of society. And while we are experiencing rapid transformations across all sectors of society at a scale and pace we haven't seen before in history. And it's being driven by the digital transformations. It's affecting how we do business. It's affecting how we interact with each other. And there are a lot of challenges we're facing in this now because of that. And that's because we didn't anticipate the rate of change and the massive implications it would have across our society. And yes, it had these aspirations that haven't been realized. But I really believe if we can really focus in on governing this system in the right way, it could have really huge transformative factors. And I'm not talking about how AI can increase efficiency in one industry. I'm thinking about cross-cutting transformative changes in how we conduct our business, how we, the underpinning of our society that has kept us in a high intensive carbon and high vulnerable situation. And I think a real focus on there, as in a way it hasn't been in the past, is coming and will make a big difference.
Great. I do have
Amy, sorry, just quick, is just that my one concern about the markets deciding is that the markets don't have conscience. The markets don't have an equity analysis. I was on a call about the Clean Power Plan, and one of the advocates made a statement. I think we can all agree that emissions reduction in the aggregate will be good for everyone. To which I said, nope. Because I represent those sacrifice zones where when we're just focusing on the aggregate, then there are certain communities that end up being sacrificed to that goal. So I'll just say that.
And Jackie, if I could just defend markets, they can be designed to make sure the unintentional but very costly effects in particular communities are avoided. So,
well, I envision
it has to be done consciously, and you're exactly right to raise it.
I imagine we would get a lot of people to join another Aspen event on the morality of the market. Really quickly, I just want, with the last 0 minutes that we have left, I want to do a lightning round question and actually borrow one of the questions from one of the audience members, Deborah Stein. And she asks, what letter grade would you give the world and the progress it's made on environmental issues since the first Earth Day? And then my question to add on to that, and very briefly, since we are out of time, what is one hopeful thing that you're thinking of as we look to the 60th anniversary of Earth Day in 2030? So first, the letter grade for the progress we've made since over the last 50 years, and then one hopeful thing. I know it might take a little while to find a hopeful thing in this world right now.
No, the letter grade, I would say the letter grade, the problem is there should be different letter grades for each country.
Yeah, that's the harder one. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's do the United States then, because that's where most of us are.
Oh, I would say we probably get a B+. If you look back at the pictures from the 70s, it's a completely different world. Now, have we turned
Must be a tough grader.
Have we turned to climate change in a meaningful way? We're just starting to, so it's certainly not an A.
So I would say that the on the grade, even if you see, is that the sort of the scale has changed, right? Or the has changed, right? So if you say 50 years ago, everybody thought of as local problems, water quality. We're now dealing with global crisis, and there's a recognition of that. So you can't separate the US from the world, because their contribution to the world brings it down much lower. And so
was that like a C+?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I know I'm not giving you a one-liner, but I do think that that's important, the scale change. But I will say my one-liner for what gives me hope. And I say this with some hesitation because it's a really challenging time, but what gives me hope is the youth. And I think it's a hard time for youth at different ages, but it still gives me hope. I think that there's a lot of energy and probably some fear right now, but I think that the energy and just sort of wisdom of that they, as they look in the future, is going to be really important for us, and we have to help them to make the changes that they want to see.
Great, Jackie, really quickly. Do you have a grade and one hopeful thing?
I would say between a C- and a D+, because the denominator is so vast. And as long as the cancer clusters that I work with every day still exist, as long as African-American children are dying of asthma at 3 to 5 times higher rate than white American children, as long as all of those things still exist, and as long as we're staring in the face of catastrophic climate change, and we're 4% of the global population and 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, and there's nations being decimated, then I would definitely say between a D+ and a C-. But the thing that is giving me hope is that people are rising up, whether it's the EJ communities, the climate justice communities, and that we're seeing these models starting to advance. And we're seeing the connections, the local to global connections happening with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance and others. That gives me some hope. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, much like the oil industry, we are in negative territory, negative time. So I want to say thank you to our panelists and the Aspen Institute and the Energy Futures Initiative for helping put on this event. And of course, most of all, thank you to everybody who has joined online, no matter where you are. And I want to wish everybody a healthy and safe rest of your Earth Day, and hopefully swift end to this pandemic.
Terrific.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.